Our next session is a panel who are going to be addressing issues around the use of AI in clinical and health applications, harnessing AI with clinical ingenuity. So I think we can all recognise that AI is already being used in areas within the NHS and within clinical diagnosis, and trying to use AI to simplify and reduce administrative burden. But on this panel, we're going to hear from some clinical leaders who are advancing AI in the front line of healthcare. And they'll be sharing some real-world examples and reflections for future directions. So a really incredibly important area, one where we think there's a huge potential. And I'm really glad to say that we have Alisha Davies, who is the Population Health Lead at the Alan Turing Institute, who will be chairing this panel. Alisha is the Head of Research and Evaluation at Public Health Wales NHS Trust. She has over 20 years' experience across NHS, local government and think tanks. She holds postgraduate degrees in epidemiology, demography and public health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also an honorary professorship at Swansea University. So, with no more ado, I will hand over to Alisha to introduce the panel. Welcome.
Thank you. I'll come up. Nice to hear. I'll come up. That was quite an introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all here this afternoon, here in the room and online. Thank you very much for joining us if you're virtual as well too. Welcome to Harnessing AI Through Clinical Ingenuity. And what a fantastic title, and that reflects the fantastic people that we have here on the panel and the stories that we're going to hear this afternoon. In the room today, we have with me to my right, I have Shakeel Ahmad, National Clinical Lead for Stroke in NHS Wales, and driving this real-world AI transforming stroke care across Wales. So we'll hear from Shakeel shortly. Followed by David Lowe, Director of Innovation in the University of Glasgow, and also working with the Scottish Government, but also a background in emergency medicine, consultant in that area and working in NHS Scotland, leading ingenious digital health validation lab up in Scotland, really exciting initiative. And then lastly is Maaike Kusters from Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, consultant pediatric immunologist and an innovation officer in that setting, leading initiatives on bringing an ambient voice into clinical practice, and can reflect a bit on that as well too. So as Anne kindly introduced at the start, the idea that technology-driven innovation can improve patient outcomes and efficiency in the NHS is certainly not new. It was highlighted over 15 years ago by Lord Darcy's report, High Quality Care for All, and it's really important, continues to be important today as well too. AI presenting a greater opportunity potentially to improve clinical decision-making, reduce inefficiencies, and move to more of a predictive, and in my world, a preventative healthcare system as well too. But let's be clear, harnessing AI in health will not happen. It doesn't just depend on the technology itself, it will depend on clinical leadership and ingenuity. And that's one of the key critical factors for AI adoption into the NHS system. So it's not just about algorithms. Clinicians are the key to ensuring that AI solutions are focused on the most critical challenges, and that it's delivering benefits across the real world and for our patients and populations as well too. So how do we make it work for clinicians and patients? Today we'll hear from my panel with me joining today across the NHS in England, Scotland and Wales. So reflections from across the UK sharing their real world insights on what's driving that adoption of AI across health. So, without further ado, Shakeel, if I could come to you first. Could you reflect a little bit, tell us a bit about what you're doing, about how you're using AI to enhance care in your field and the impact that you're seeing that?
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Alisha, and good afternoon, everyone. Within the healthcare settings, AI is being adopted quite a bit within radiology as well. And me being a stroke physician, we need to make sure that we're selecting the right group of patients at the right time to make sure that they have the treatment urgently as well. So when you're having a stroke, every minute you're losing 2 million brain cells a minute. So it's really critical that we make sure that we're identifying the right patients so we can then treat the patients with either a clot-busting drug called thrombolysis or a procedure called thrombectomy, where you go in and you take the clot out of the brain. So what we've done is that, we've adopted using the AI technology in all our stroke imaging pathways across Wales. So we've got it embedded in every hospital in Wales. So when a patient comes into the scanner, if they're suspected to have a stroke, the AI system will, look at it. And if it picks up what we call a large vessel occlusion, then it'll immediately notify all the clinical teams around us that there is a patient here that needs urgent attention immediately. So what it's doing is kind of speeding that pathway up and identifying the patients as quickly as possible as well. So then we can then immediately then go in and act and try and treat the patient as well. Funnily enough, we were just in the waiting room and I had a ping on my phone. So the other thing is that it pings you on your phone and you can immediately see the scans as well. So then having access, as clinicians, having access to the imaging, we can really make that decision much more quicker. So it really, really enhances the pathway. So for me, it's about enhancing clinical pathways as well. With that adjunct technology, that gives me all that extra information so we can make a very quick decision for time-dependent treatments as well. And we are seeing some really good outcomes in some of us. We rolled this out across Wales it started about 18 months ago. All the hospitals are live. And some of the data we've seen from some of our hospitals is where we've seen our thrombolysis rate, which is a clot-busting drug, which is 20% is the kind of the golden target. Some hospitals are hitting above 22% from 6%. And then thrombectomy rate, which is where you take the clot out, you want to hit about 10% of patients would be eligible for thrombectomy. And one of our centres are hitting nearly up to 9%, so already coming up to that level as well. So so it's enhancing the pathway, I would say, for the urgent treatment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shakeel. It's just really exciting to hear about AI in practice and how that and the difference that that's making as well too. David, in your field.
Thank you very much, Alisha, and thank you very much for the invite to speak today. So, David Lowe, and I'm Professor of Health Innovation with the University of Glasgow, and I suppose what we've really focused on is understanding the needs of our clinical teams to be able to answer the question about which AI can we adopt and should we adopt, and really help them build the evidence. And sometimes that's around about working with both industry and academic partners around the usual paradigm of test, train, validate, and accessing to large corpuses of real-world data to be able to say how this solution is going to be deployed in that particular setting. But then increasingly, and really the focus and the portfolio of work that I own within the emergency department and really unscheduled care is around about an understanding of how these technologies can be deployed into a real world setting. And we start to develop the evidence around about and align it to nice evidence standard frameworks around about clinical effectiveness, cost effectiveness, the performance of the AI in the device in silico, and then in a real world data set, and acceptability. And Alisha and I were just talking about, again, that requirement around sustainability. Yes, cost, but also carbon starting to come into our decision making within government and within the boards around about those solutions we're being able to deploy. When you look at the kind of unscheduled care piece, and Alicia's already acknowledged the Darcy report and the NHS being in a critical condition, the very obvious manifestation of that is ambulances stacked outside my emergency department, any emergency department across the healthcare system in the UK. And we see excess deaths from that, well reported, 1.5 million patients. And what do we do with those individuals that are waiting greater than 12 hours to come into hospital? And really that leads us to two questions. One about how can we identify those with long-term conditions predominantly because they're well characterised in our data, to be able to identify those with heart failure, COPD, diabetes that have already got that diagnosis, and how can we manage them proactively in the community, leveraging AI against the data that these individuals already produce on their devices, on their other touch points into healthcare. And then secondly, around about identification of those without yet that diagnosis. So 80% of people get a heart failure diagnosis in an emergency department, 40 to 50% get a lung cancer diagnosis. And these are people that stay a long time in hospital, often have late phase disease. So lung cancer, it's about 70% have stage 3-4 disease, which really changes the care quality we can deliver for them, and therefore is a motivation for decision makers at chief exec level, at government level, around how can we identify those patients at risk, initiate them on therapy, and reduce the risk of future hospitalizations and all the bad things that happen when you come into an emergency department or into a hospital. And then lastly, and I suppose we've already had a comment around about that, about optimization of clinical pathways. Some of that's operational, like estimated discharge dates, mortality prediction that you could use a regression-based model to do, but AI deals with the heterogeneity of data that's generated in a large hospital system such as Greater Glasgow and Clyde to do that, but then think about clinical pathway, and that's really critical, is an understanding of how can we deploy technology, layer it into our current digital maturity, and we were talking about that earlier, around about how much some systems still use bits of paper, to be able to think about where do we land that technology. Is it about prediction of stroke and detection of LVO? Is it thinking about pulmonary embolism? But critically, how does it activate a workforce that is really diverse, to be able to understand and utilise that technology to its best effect? And that's again where we come back in around about describing when are we thinking about augmenting a current clinical system, enhancing it, disrupting and then transforming. And I think increasingly what we're having to do is having very direct conversations with our board chief execs and indeed others around about why are we deploying this, and what change are you thinking you will be able to demonstrate, and how do we gather evidence to support its scale and spread? And that's often with our industry partners, to be able to think about, again, the opportunities to develop evidence for a positive or indeed a negative decision around about not yet because of either performance of device or maturity of this clinical system that you're deploying that technology into. And I think that's really critical as we move forward, a really clear understanding of our decision making around about AI is probably not the panacea for all of our challenges around about healthcare delivery, but really targeted interventions such as coordination of stroke care is a really good example of how you can deploy technology that builds confidence and therefore allows you to start to ask the question about how do you use that same technology for pulmonary embolism detection, which is just a clot in your lung as opposed to in your head. So I'll stop there and pass over. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Many thanks, David. And that kind of transferability of learning, you touched on that from one discipline to another, is where different clinical specialties are moving at different speeds with some of this innovation, but the potential to learn from across those different disciplines is really, really key, I think. Mike, in your area, what's happening?
Very specialized hospital, of course, as a tertiary children's hospital with very rare diseases, and like, I'm doing treatments like gene therapy or bone marrow transplant or thymus transplant. So instead of focusing on like ultra rare diseases in children, we have an innovation center, and we also try to focus on what do all doctors need, not just in Great Ormond Street, where we have this unique sort of ability to have this innovation center and a bit of funding, you know, to also accelerate these kind of ideas, but also like, how does this translate? Why did you become a doctor? Is it because you love to stare at computer screens? Is it because you love to do a lot of admin? Or is it actually because you love to work with humans and you want to understand the body and you want to, you know, treat or even prevent diseases? So the project that I would like to highlight, but there are loads of other projects, is the ambient conversation tool. So what you notice if you come into a hospital and you have a clinical appointment, you know, the doctor brings you into the room, the doctor will see you now, but actually the moment you step into the room, the doctor is not looking at you anymore. They're going straight into their computer. They might introduce themselves and say hello, and then they move away from you and they stare at the computer. They're typing lots of things, they're looking at lots of things, and then from this side, information is coming in, that apparently is a dialogue. I don't know, if you normally have a dialogue, is that how you do it? Are you just like staring at random places? Is that how we speak to each other? This is not how we speak to each other. And health, health is the most important thing. If people say like, what's important for you? It's like, I'm healthy, happy, if possible, for myself and for my loved ones. So health is very important. So you want to have a meaningful conversation. So instead of this staring at a computer screen, we actually want to look at our patient and have this conversation again. So what we did, this is actually also funded by NHS England, we started to do an ambient conversation tool, a speech-to-text tool. You're mic'd up, sort of like I am now. Actually 2 mics in the room with a 200-meter action radius, because I work with children. They're not going to sit on the chair, they're going to move around, and that's perfectly fine, because we can pick up any signal. And then you can sort of start this when the patient comes in. You can even already say, this patient coming in, this is the background condition, etc. You have already your own sort of designed template for your note and for your letter. And then when the patient comes in, you can have just complete random, doesn't have to be in a specific order, conversation about the history, physical examination. You can say it out loud. You can walk after the child when you are listening to the chest, or it doesn't really matter. And then in the end, this tool actually collects the medical data. So you can talk about football, your favorite book, it doesn't really matter. It collects the medical data and then it translates this into the template. It makes a note, and you can then just copy the note into your electronic patient record. Why is it relevant to actually copy the patient record like in the notes and not have it in electronic patient record? Is that a lot of the digital patient record systems are very commercial. They're often driven by sort of global companies, and the moment you build in all these AI tools embedded in your EPR, then actually it becomes very expensive. It becomes expensive per person, per hospital, and it's not something I think we can afford within the NHS. So we need to build our own tools, sort of homegrown UK stuff. And then if we can then embed it and showcase, for instance, in Great Ormond Street that this works, then you can also translate it to the wider NHS. And so these best practices, and if you have that opportunity within your hospital or in primary healthcare, if it then works, then you need to accelerate and deploy it. And this is the next step. So we have now done over 6,000 clinical observations. We already see, the patients are really happy with it because we're actually having this conversation again. It saves time. That's still, I think, work in progress. And also it actually shortens a little bit the appointment time. So that is already quite beneficial. And it's now going to be deployed sort of within London area, across ambulances, primary care, and more hospitals. Yeah.
It's just fantastic. And what's really interesting about that use case is that there's this narrative that AI will lose that human connection, but actually this is an example where the use of an AI tool is helping to enhance that human connection. Exactly. Because it's taking away the collecting the information that's being transferred and that kind of connection.
Yeah. It's doing sort of the hard work in the background, like this cognitive overload when you have all this data and you lose the connection with the patient, and you can connect with the patient and focus more on the complex decision making, and the cognitive overload of all the stuff coming towards you should be done in the background.
Yeah. Fantastic. If we could hear from you a little bit about a reflection, the work that you were doing, what has enabled that success about bringing in those tools into your own areas, your own spaces, and how can that help them with that kind of acceleration of deployment? So what's helped to enable some of that success? Shakeel.
Right. Yeah, well, I kind of describe the NHS as like a big oil tanker, and when you want to make change, it takes a lot of energy and a lot of hard work, And some of the big challenges we had, was around procurement and deployment of the technology. Huge barriers. Within Wales, we've got like 7 health boards, and when we wanted to go in and make the changes, we had to go through a whole load of process 7 times as well. So I think it's really important to see how we can remove some of those barriers as well. That will help to make this work. Such as you need some resources around that as well for some project management, etc. And then you need the governance structures as well around that for the DPIAs, etc., cybersecurity, data management, to really, so we can have that done nationally, but then also then give it to the local teams as well to work around that. And then I think the other value is, the real key thing is the evidence of value of the system, because if you can prove, so from my perspective, we're showing that, this can make a huge difference to patients' lives. You have a patient with a stroke, comes in completely hemiplegic, and if you can treat them and treat them quickly and restore their function, that's a huge gain to not just to the healthcare system, to society overall as well. Mm-hmm. So having that kind of drive and the evidence value around that as well is a key driver to show the clinical effectiveness of the unmet need as well. Mm-hmm. And then sharing the learning that you have from that, then it brings people on board as well. So I think, it's bringing everybody on board with you around that as well. You need obviously the early adopters to push it, but I think soon as you start seeing some outcomes and some really positive data, and from a clinician's perspective, so Maaike was talking about, having more clinical time, it will free more time up for the clinicians to do some of more the complex work as well, that some of the AI technology can then take off you as well.
How did you find your early adopters? You being one of them. How did you bring along everybody else with you?
Right, yeah. So started a good few years ago in the sense that, when we were discussing it, there was obviously various camps. But I think that for me, at the end of the day, we're doctors, we're clinicians, and at the heart of it is the patient. So if you can bring the patient's story at the heart and show this is the benefit that they are getting, then you'll find that the clinicians will fall behind that, Mm-hmm. And then if you've got data to prove it and show those benefits, then, then it's, and then you can then show the cost effectiveness and the value around that to get the funding and the resources around that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Shakeel. David?
Yeah, so I suppose great question. I agree, Shakeel, around about infrastructure that takes some of the burden of information governance, data access, and equally is able to demonstrate the offer and the capability to be able to provision 2.2 million chest x-rays or a cut of data that allows you to train that model within a trusted research environment rapidly. I think two other things that go along with that is this kind of concept of porosity of how do you bring, again, the kind of deep science, deep tech capability, clinical academics and the NHS in the broader sense together, and an understanding of prioritisation about where we're going to engage in a research piece of work around about test, train, validate of a particular solution that's quite far off deployment at scale within the NHS. And that's got really meaningful, and there's a group of people that will engage with that, and it's how do you signpost to those individuals versus those that are much more focused on the translational aspects of that. And again, that requires leadership, and how do you train that leadership? And we were talking a little about that before, around about we've got 10 innovation fellows and Scottish Government funds and other tranches centrally as well, that we host some of them again to build capability, understanding, and be able to go across disciplines and be able to kind of share that knowledge and some of the methodology for evaluation, which is really critical. That sometimes it is a rapid evaluation that's required to give people confidence around about safety and performance, moving into that much deeper requirement around about evidence again. So I think there's a understanding that how do we create infrastructure, how do we give people time and capabilities to be able to engage, and you have to invest in that. And there was a lecture earlier today around about fellowship programs to be able to do that. And then finally leadership and that almost chimeric function and be able to straddle slightly uncomfortably the requirements of your boards, the government and the NHS to be able to start to think about how you build capability for our workforce to adopt these technologies. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Lovely, thanks.
Yeah.
Maaike?
I think it's more bottom up than top down. So if people say, okay, this is what we're going to do with our NHS oil tanker, then that's not going to work for healthcare professionals, because we have an autonomy in our critical decision making, and we will be stubborn about this because we also will be proud about what we do. So you have to ask us what we want, and not just me as a doctor. My nurses on the ward, they have 12-hour shifts, so they are exposed to lots of technology that works or doesn't work, while they're also looking after and a child and the family, and they have to support all this while not making any mistake for any of the IVs or any of the other things that they are doing. These are 12-hour shifts, so what do you need? So I think what we set up is quite nice in Innovation Center. So we have embedding also from like industry partners. So, you know, you cannot just bring in an industry partner and just, you know, freestyle behind an NHS firewall with some AI tools. You cannot even install most of the AI tools, and there's a reason, of course, for this. But we also have a CIU, a Clinical Insights Unit, and these are the innovation officers, and these are people like pharmacists, nurses, physio, doctors from across the hospital. And they come up with not just their own ideas, not just like, oh, I want this, you know, for immunology, this little niche. And it goes through an innovation platform. And then there's a sort of a group behind it to say, let's accelerate this, or this has a benefit for the wider organization. And then you get sort of the resources, because often the management layers, it's such a Sudoku, like how to find the right people. And how can I really accelerate this in the limited time that I have available on top of my clinical workload? I need to sort of, you know, have an hour here and 10 minutes there, and this is where it needs to happen. So we need that support. So we need the governance in place, the framework, the support. I don't have time to do all that. So the information governance, all of these things, other people need to do that. I need to come with the stuff that we need. And also our patients, they have quite a say in these things. So children, of course, are the most open-minded, curious, you know, people out there, and they can really come up with great ideas that I can't even think of, and that's amazing. And that's exactly, of course, why I work with children.
Fantastic. Shakeel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think you make a really strong point there. I mean, if you want this technology to succeed, it has to be from bottom up. All the projects I've worked with, if you work from the bottom up and those who are at the cold face and at the interface, then you'll see better adoption and using that as well. And I think that within healthcare, you know, sometimes we get a product to say, here it is, make it work. And we should turn it around. What we should be doing is saying, right, this is my problem, and we should be working with our industry partners and saying, right, how can we come up with a solution? And if we come up with a solution there, then it will be, you know, more likely to succeed around that. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the thing, is that, you know, you engage with, you know, so I engage with all my clinical colleagues first before we decide to, you know, go on any sort of journey and see what the test of water really, yeah.
I think the reflections from each of you is that it just goes to show the complexity of the system that you're trying to work in, but the system from the patient through to the clinician, through to procurement, to digital infrastructure, the data infrastructure, and how to bring all of those pieces together to help it to move forward. We will have a Slido chat slide that will come up in a little minute. For those of you that are online or in the room, very welcome to pop questions into that. And in the room, we'll come around for some questions in a minute as well too. Maybe while you're all thinking, I'm just going to pose one more question to the three of you, which is, what would be like your key lesson that you've learned about integrating that AI into day-to-day NHS, which is quite clunky, doesn't matter which part of the UK you're sat in. What would be your one reflection on that? Who would like to go first?
So I start. I think it's a really good question, really important. What we typically do, and I suppose this is a hard-won lesson of deploying at least 10 AI solutions into various different contexts, including the emergency department, which obviously is stressed and challenged and trying to keep business as usual going in spite of everything else that's going on. I think what we end up doing is, as has been described, taking that step back and really systematically understanding both the performance of the proposed device, if it's coming at that kind of level of we've got this solution that's potentially available, it's got its CE mark, but then really think about patient flows, data flows, clinician flows, and what happens to the bow wave activity that is inevitably created. That stroke's a good example, lung cancer, chest x-ray, AI detection, moving into what do you do with nodule management, and being really systematic in understanding clinical pathways, and really importantly in the digital validation lab that I work as their lead, is really focused on taking that step back and being really clear that it's not asking Professor David Lowe what he thinks, because he's got absolutely no idea what happens at 2 o'clock in the morning in my emergency department, frankly. Bad things if I'm there, and I'm usually in a hoodie. So it's therefore being able to sit back and ask the physios, the nursing staff, the healthcare support workers, their understanding of what happens, because that's really critical. They're the people that are going to be using these devices, interacting with them on a daily basis without necessarily the deep-seated knowledge I've developed over the last couple of years of working in this area that allows it to happen routinely as part of practice and not to be something that's just appended on when I happen to be around and people open up the radiology screen and will look at the secondary capture or do that other thing that I think is augmenting, enhancing their practice, but actually in reality is creating a burden. So that step back, critical understanding and allowing the voices of all those individuals, including critically the patient, to understand what does that workflow look like within the context of that technology, but importantly either side of it, and taking the stakeholders on either side along with you as well. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, David.
Yeah, for me it's start at the beginning. So instead of, you get a pop-up on LinkedIn, DeepSeek, live now, and then you think, okay, let's do this, let's get this into the hospital. Well, that's not going to happen. You have to start at the beginning and not at the end. So the beginning is how you collect the data. So I have the opportunity to have like an electronic patient record, but if you work in a hospital where you still have paper, and the file becomes heavier than the actual child, then you have a problem, because how are you going to apply AI on a 3-kilo file and say, okay, let's do some AI? Well, you can't read half of the notes, so you might as well give me a cassette player, right? I can't do anything with AI with this. So it starts at the beginning. How are we collecting the data in a systematic way? So you need to have it digitalized. This is the first thing that you need for everyone in the NHS. Then the second thing is, I did sort of a presentation about my human phenotype ontology, which I really love, but actually I compared it with a beehive. So I'm sort of in the hospital, this is my little beehive. I can sort of, as a bee, I can sort of collect the right ingredients that are available to me. So that depends on what quality ingredients I can sort of fly into my beehive. But normally in nature, in a beehive, you have a queen bee. This is actually a she, and she decides what goes and what doesn't go, what's the culture, what's the agreed language. But what did we do? Have we actually agreed in medicine what our agreed language is? Like if you look at like the scientific outputs that we make, but also how we collect the data in hospitals or in any part of the system, how do we collect our data is not that systematic as we think it is. So if we haven't even agreed on that, why are we talking about AI? So I think start at the beginning and then work to the end.
Lovely. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, and I disagree with Maaike and David with where they've covered all the points. It is look at the problem and engaging with the stakeholders and the patient, and then making sure that you bring the team along and and looking at solving that problem actually. And I think we've already covered that area earlier.
Fantastic. I've got some questions here on Slido, and I think we've got roaming mics in the room. I'm not sure. Yes, someone waving. So if you want to pop your hand up if you have a question in the room. While you're thinking, Maaike, we've a question for you. When can we expect to see the types of tools that you're using in London hospitals and ambulances, and could it be implemented in the care sector as well?
Yeah, 100%. I was actually quite keen to implement it in mental health, because we have such an amount of waiting lists and backlogs and issues in mental health, especially in children's mental health. And, of course, I work in very rare diseases, but you need to have a holistic approach. You need to try to prevent diseases, but also you need to have that, support for mental health while the child is growing and developing. And it just breaks your heart if you see that your child needs mental health support and then can't reach it or not in time. Like a waiting list for 1 year is way too long for a child. It's not acceptable. So we're now deploying it first in like ambulances, which will also be quite dynamic, I think, and in sort of primary healthcare and in hospitals. But I think the next target to hit, I think, is mental health, mental health care.
Okay.
So yeah, it's 100% possible.
And they were particularly asking about the ambulances. Where can people find out more about that kind of journey, or what happens next? Is that the London Ambulance Trust, or is it?
At the moment it is. It sort of sits with funding, but I think it's actually accelerating quite quick considering sort of started last year. So it has been accelerating, quick in an NHS environment, but over time it would be great to have it everywhere. But it also sits in, again, and then how that data is then coming together. So you also need to have something electronic behind it, and not to record something and then actually
it's not used.
You have a paper file still. Yeah. So it needs to go hand in hand. Yeah. Yeah.
And in the room, were there hands up? There's one hand over there. Yeah. If you could just introduce yourself as well, that would be wonderful.
I'm Prenika. I'm a researcher in AI safety at the University of York. My topic is more on assistive devices and assistive technologies for older people. And there's wide research on structural ageism around inclusion of older people in AI data and also design. So I'm very keen to hear directly from the clinicians on what they think about this issue.
So representativeness, really, and older people.
I think, great question. I think it depends where you're deploying that AI technology. There's clearly that thread around about social care and how you're deploying it directly into people's homes and be able to use agentic agents, ambient sensors and those components to be able to start to think about risk and management and loneliness, which I think is really an important factor that we have to start talking about, especially as we start to pull some of the kind of contact points that older people would typically have and lose that. And I'm always really thoughtful when I come to the board with a decision around about how do we optimize patients with, so we don't bring them in for routine appointments with Parkinson's. But actually that's a key touch point often for these individuals. So we have to think about that equity of access and the wider halo impact of it. I think the other part of it is about data and ultimately how do you generate that. And the piece I often have to say to my engineer colleagues is 25% of the population in Greater Glasgow and Clyde don't have broadband, don't have Wi-Fi access, therefore, and that is propensity towards people that are older, ethnic minorities, more deprived groups. So again, there has to be an understanding of how, when you're deploying these technologies, how do you balance that equity, equality of care access, that if you're constantly just reshuffling the pack based upon data availability, then potentially those individuals with heart failure over the age of 80, which is 50% of our population, don't get seen as often and have as optimized care as those others. So complicated, but ultimately it's about being very clear about what some of the outcomes can be if you start to deploy these technologies into groups of people that don't necessarily have the same digital signature to train AI with, if that's a broad oversimplification.
Yeah. I think it's a really important question because you have an aging population. I work with children, so I have no aging population on my side because then I would transition to these colleagues. But the aging population is quite relevant. If I look at, for instance, my own mother-in-law, she had these crooked fingers. So even if you would think about smart devices, she wouldn't be even able to swipe to open it, right? So I think you have a big role there as healthcare professionals to drive that forward, to have, for instance, fall risk or reminders, but if they're popping up and they can't swipe it, there's a lot of, I think, advocacy for aging population coming from the healthcare community. Yeah.
Yep. So, now I agree. I think there's, we've got a big problem ahead. Well, I wouldn't say problem, a growing demand ahead of us. So the Resolution Foundation predicted by 2035. Healthcare costs will go up by 100 billion and pensions by 40 billion. That's 140 billion extra. That's 7% of our GDP we need to grow by. And so we need to make sure that we're optimizing all our pathways and care to meet that demand as well. And from a stroke perspective, we've got the atrial fibrillation as well, which is an irregular heartbeat that increases your risk by stroke by 5-fold. There are lots of technologies which are out there to try and collect some of that data and making sure we're optimizing that. We did do a project which I led on in Wales called Stop a Stroke, where we optimized the anticoagulation pathway in the community using some of the modules with primary care. We incentivized that, and we saw our anticoagulation rate go up from 72% to 89% across Wales as well. That's a huge reduction because when you have AF-related strokes, they are the most severest type of stroke. Think of it like a little DVT, but it's in the brain, you know, and you've thrown up a big clot off as well. And I think the other 2 points, if we're looking at the elderly population, because obviously a lot of my patients are in that category, you know, there is the issue about using the technology and then also looking at the health inequalities as well and having access to the technology as well. So we have to balance all these things when we're deploying as well.
Mm-hmm. And capturing some of that, I presume, in the evaluation, that kind of post-deployment question is a question about, you know, how do you know in those instances where AI prediction or AI tools have got it wrong? So how do you monitor that in clinical practice once things have deployed into that space?
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time on this, and we've deployed platforms, and I'm involved in the Centre of Excellence for Regulatory Science, and really part of that is platforming to be able to, when you start to deploy technology in radiology, pathology, dermatology is the most mature currently for AI, that we actually are starting to look at what's our approach to performance management sampling. Is it just 2 standard deviations off a threshold for prediction, or what else are you doing to be able to start to think about which the elderly population, how do you start to sample meaningfully against the known performance of an AI versus prevalence of disease and other factors, and it becomes rapidly an existential and relatively difficult challenge around about what's good enough in terms of performance management against the misnomer that is AI drift versus really challenges around about population prevalence and other clinical features that change and pathways that actually have a bigger effect on presentation of disease.
Yeah, and also actually for the elder population, it might not be a real appetite to learn a lot about AI per se, but for instance, you have also a lot of wearables where actually the monitoring is done outside of your own control. But if you, for instance, have a baseline heart rate or specific, vital signs, and you're deviating from those vital signs, this can be an early, sign for, sepsis or something else, or your motion, if you're out of balance, this might be relevant. So you could also think about more like a wearable approach for the elderly population that can actually monitor in the background and then alert, my colleagues to do the next steps for them. So more a community approach, like cocooning almost the patient, or not even the patient, to prevent to become a patient. And with that approach, I think wearables are the way forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Right, I've time for just one more question, maybe from the room. Your hand was up first. So if...
Hi,
thank you.
Usmani, Professor of Clinical AI at Queen Mary. So great talk, but something, I guess, these technologies will require a lot of maintenance post-deployment, especially if your data changes that you mentioned, for example, due to demographic changes. So I'm just wondering, how do you see kind of, making these technologies self-sustainable? Do you see that being funded by public money, or is there another model that may be applied?
Thank you. Tricky question.
So I'll go first, and then it seems to be my role.
Like to take that?
The emergency physician coming to the fore. So I think great question. I think there's a procurement question there around about how do we, if it's an industry partner, a CMARC tool, then is that built into the service model, and what requirements are we actually asking the company to cover off? And they've obviously got increasing requirements around about total product cycle, evaluation, reporting. But I think we also have to be able to describe what the requirements are for the clinical teams or the operational teams to be able to engage in that process, which I think is really important, which leads on to workforce and education and be able to factor that in. And increasingly what we were discussing about this about stroke is what's the business case for this, and some of it's deriving both clinical and cost effectiveness, what might be in-year savings, which is very hard to manifest in this particular area, versus what that might be able to look at. And again, with our health economist colleagues, it's about describing, yes, qualities, but other more mature, sophisticated approach to reimbursement actually reflect improving outcomes of care, as well as chief execs will often say you just need to save money in years. So I think it's about an understanding of a business case actually takes in those components of what's the service model when this is running as business usual, not with a wraparound of my research unit and surveillance and pharmacovigilance and all those things that are there when I'm doing research that are not there when you leave it into the wild, but still require the same degree of optimization, certainly in this next phase over the next couple of years.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
We're rapidly running out of time. I've got enough questions on Slido to have a whole day on this topic, but they've only given us 45 minutes. Put that in your feedback forms for AI UK 2026. But before we wrap up, if I could come back to each of you just for a quick 30-second, what does the future look like in 5 years from now? And what would be your one thing that would help us get there?
Well, I don't think there's any quick fix like people think. Obviously the government would like to use AI for the civil service. There's no quick fix. The technology has to learn itself. For me, the big thing in the future is that if we can crunch all the data and, if we select the right patient for the right treatment at the right time, crunching all that data together over time. And I think that would be really optimizing the care for me in the future. And I think in about 5 years' time, maybe people will be coming along and it'll be adopted around that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Optimising data for patient care. David?
Yeah, I'm going to be slightly contrary to what I said before around about shared priorities. I think what we're seeing, and this is, I suppose, the challenge to people in the room, is understanding that these technologies, especially generative AI, there's going to be a huge paradigm shift, and therefore there's a requirement for you to educate us around about these technologies and the potential benefits, and then be able to start to think about the clinical use cases. I think, how do we bridge that gap from what is now there and parts of my working and bringing them into the clinical space and be able to democratize that? And I think that's probably the core challenges: partnerships, deep tech, and adoption against the critical challenges that we face in terms of care delivery. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks,
Yeah.
David.
I think we're still in a sort of hunters and collectors phase. This is where we are. And we need an evolutionary acceleration, almost like once in a lifetime acceleration for the NHS. But if we can do this, if we can create, the governance, the digitalization, and the right data collection, you also have this unique system. Because the NHS, you're born in the NHS, you die in the NHS, you have lifelong data for a whole population, which can basically provide the backbone for all future healthcare, preventive or curative. So you are basically building your own population data set. So if you get this right, you are uniquely positioned in the world.
Fantastic. And I like your point, David. I'm going to use that kind of bridging that gap between innovators, researchers, and clinicians. And we're here as part of the Turing Clinical AI Special Interest Group. You're more than welcome to join. It's free to join. It's an online community, but it's about striving to really harness AI, but into clinical practice and into the NHS, and bridging some of those gaps. Thank you ever so much for joining us this afternoon and online. And just to say thank you to our 3 fantastic panellists this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day at AI UK.